She crouched in the corner of the prison hospital ward as British nurses approached, clutching her newborn son to her chest, certain of one thing: they would take him from her arms. The warnings had been explicit. The British would steal German babies for their own childless families. But when Annaliese Weber refused to hand over her 3-day-old infant in a makeshift hospital in Scotland in the winter of 1945, one nurse did something she never expected. She didn't demand the baby. She sat down on the floor beside Annaliese instead. And then, without asking permission, she gently held the child first, not to take him away, but to show a terrified mother that her son was safe. Before we uncover this remarkable story, if you enjoy learning about these forgotten chapters of World War II history, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. These stories deserve to be preserved. The war in Europe was entering its final, brutal months on January the 20th, 1945. But for Annaliese Weber, a 23-year-old radar technician from Dresden, that date marked not the end of conflict, but the beginning of something she couldn't comprehend. She had spent the last 18 months operating detection equipment in occupied Norway, her fingers adjusting frequency dials in a coastal bunker that smelled of salt water and machine oil. Her husband Johan had been killed at Stalingrad 2 years earlier. She had received the official notification in March 1943. She knew exactly what those words meant, though she'd spent months unable to accept them. When the British forces arrived as Norway was liberated, they gathered up everyone connected to German occupation infrastructure. Annaliese was 7 months pregnant. Her condition was unmistakable beneath her worn auxiliary uniform. The other women whispered fears as they waited in processing lines. The British will take pregnant women to special facilities. They'll use you for medical research. They'll steal your baby the moment it's born and place it with British families. The rumours circulated like poison, each one more horrifying than the last. Annaliese said nothing. She placed both hands on her belly and felt the movement inside. This child was all she had left. Johan was dead. Her family home in Dresden would soon be destroyed, though she didn't know that yet. Her mother and sister had fled to relatives in the countryside, and she had no way to contact them. This baby, this small life growing inside her, was the only future that remained. The journey across the North Sea took 9 hours. The ship was a converted fishing trawler, its hold packed with German prisoners. Annaliese shared a cramped compartment with 42 other women, most of them young, all of them terrified and depleted. The smell of fear and bilge water filled every breath. Many were seasick, vomiting into pails that sloshed with the vessel's pitching. Annaliese was fortunate. Her stomach remained steady, though whether that was the pregnancy or simple numbness, she couldn't determine. During those long hours at sea, the women talked in whispers. They shared stories they'd heard about British prison facilities. Some said the British worked prisoners to death in munitions factories. Others claimed prisoners were locked in cells without heat through the Scottish winter. A woman named Kether, who had been a nurse's aide, told Annaliese directly one evening, "They won't let you keep the baby. British women lost children in the bombing. They want German infants to replace what they lost. They'll take yours before you even name it. You won't get to hold it." Annaliese didn't sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bunk, feeling her son kick and turn inside her. She had already decided the baby was a boy, though she had no rational reason to think so. She had even chosen a name. "Johan, after his father," she whispered to the child in the darkness, her lips barely moving. "I won't let them take you, I promise. I will fight them with everything I have before I let them separate us." The ship finally reached port in Aberdeen on a bitter morning in late January. The Scottish sky was iron grey, heavy with the threat of snow. Annaliese had not seen such a sky in months. Back in Dresden, before she'd been sent to Norway, the skies had been perpetually dark with smoke from raids. Here, the clouds were just winter clouds. The cold that struck as she descended the gangway was unlike anything she'd experienced. Not the dry cold of Germany or the damp cold of Norway. This was wind-driven, bone-penetrating cold that made breathing painful. The freezing air hit her like a physical blow. It was nothing like the winters she remembered from home. This was raw, relentless cold that found every gap in clothing and settled deep in the chest. Her uniform, already inadequate, offered no protection. The other women stumbled on the dock, shivering uncontrollably. British soldiers watched them with expressions Annaliese couldn't decipher. Not quite hostile, just watchful, distant. They were loaded into trucks that smelled of canvas and diesel. The benches were metal, freezing to the touch. The canvas sides snapped in the wind. As the truck pulled away from the harbour, Annaliese peered through a gap and stared at a world that seemed impossible. Buildings stood complete, their roofs intact. Shops had lights in the windows despite the afternoon gloom. People walked on streets that weren't cratered, wearing heavy coats, carrying on with ordinary existence. Children ran alongside the truck, shouting things she couldn't understand. A man walked a dog. Keta, sitting beside Annaliese, whispered, "Look at it. Not a single destroyed building, not one fire-damaged wall. They won the war without ever experiencing what we experienced." Annaliese said nothing, but the sight filled her with something she couldn't identify. It wasn't quite bitterness. It wasn't quite wonder. It was more like incomprehension. This was the enemy. These people with their intact cities and functioning infrastructure. The propaganda had told them Britain was broken, desperate, barely surviving. The reality was entirely different. The truck drove for hours through landscape that seemed endless. Rolling hills covered in brown winter grass stretched to distant horizons. Stone farmhouses with smoke rising from chimneys dotted the countryside. Sheep huddled in groups against stone walls. Everything looked untouched, ancient, enduring. Annaliese thought of the flattened villages around Dresden, the burned forests, the roads choked with refugees. The contrast was almost too much to process. Finally, as darkness began to fall, the truck turned off the main road and approached a gate with guard towers. A sign read, "Camp Glenmore, Inverness Shire, Prisoner of War Facility." The gates swung open and the truck rolled through into a compound of long wooden buildings surrounded by barbed wire. This was to be their home, though none of them knew for how long. The processing area was inside a cold wooden building that smelled of coal smoke and damp wool. The women were directed to form lines. British officers sat at tables with stacks of paperwork and manual typewriters that clattered steadily. One by one, the women stepped forward to be documented. Names were recorded, numbers were assigned, photographs were taken. When Annaliese's turn came, she approached the table slowly, both hands pressed protectively against her belly. The officer was an older woman with grey hair pulled back severely and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She looked like someone who'd spent a lifetime not suffering fools. She glanced at Annaliese's stomach and then at her forms. "Name?" she asked in clipped English. "Annaliese Weber," she replied, her English heavily accented but clear. She had learned English in school, though she'd rarely spoken it. "Age?" 23. The officer typed for a moment, then looked up at Annaliese again, her eyes moving to her belly once more. The propaganda machine had worked relentlessly for years to create this image of Britain. Through radio broadcasts, newsreels, and official pronouncements, the German people had been fed a continuous stream of information designed to make them despise and underestimate the British. The British were portrayed as decadent aristocrats ruling over a crumbling empire. They were weak, morally corrupt, incapable of real sacrifice. They would fold under pressure. And yet, here was the reality. British officers in organised facilities, processing thousands of prisoners with systematic efficiency. British trucks transporting supplies in quantities Germany hadn't seen in years. British infrastructure that suggested anything but weakness. Every interaction contradicted the propaganda. But Annaliese was too frightened and too consumed by her pregnancy to process these contradictions yet. That would come later, in the long weeks ahead. The terror of what would happen to her baby overwhelmed everything else. In her more lucid moments, Annaliese told herself the rumours couldn't all be true. Medical experiments in infant theft and systematic cruelty couldn't all be happening at once. But lucidity had little place in a world that had become nothing but chaos. She had watched her country commit unspeakable acts. Why should the victors be any different? Why should the British show compassion when Germany had shown none? "When is the child due?" she asked. Annaliese's heart pounded. This was it. This was when they would mark her as different, separate her from the others. This was when they would begin whatever process they used to take babies from their mothers. Her voice emerged as barely audible. "March, early March." The officer nodded and made a notation on her form. Then she did something Annaliese didn't expect. She removed her spectacles and looked directly at Annaliese with something that might have been concern. "We'll notify the camp medical staff," she said. "You'll be monitored and receive supplementary rations. When your time comes, you'll be taken to the hospital facility." Annaliese stared at her, unable to process the words. Medical monitoring, supplementary rations. She had expected isolation, experimentation, separation. Instead, this stern-looking woman was discussing her health, the baby's health, as though these things mattered, as though she were a person deserving of care rather than an enemy deserving of punishment. She was directed to the next station where a medical officer waited. The officer was a man in his 60s, with white hair and tired eyes. He spoke to Annaliese in simple English, and when Annaliese struggled to comprehend, he fetched another prisoner who spoke both languages to interpret. Through the translator, the medical officer explained that Annaliese would receive an examination within the week. She would be given vitamin supplements. Her diet would include additional milk and eggs to support the pregnancy. She would be assigned light duties that wouldn't endanger her condition. And when labour began, she would be transported to the camp hospital, where she would deliver under medical supervision. Annaliese listened to all of this with mounting disbelief. Every word contradicted everything she had been conditioned to expect. She wanted to ask, "Why? Why are you doing this? Why do you care if my baby survives?" But she couldn't find the words. She simply nodded and allowed herself to be led to the next station. The bathing facility was next, and here Annaliese's fear intensified. She had heard stories about this stage of processing. The chambers where they poisoned you. The rooms where they humiliated you. She entered a large concrete room with other women, all of them shaking, all of them anticipating the worst. But there was no poison. There was no humiliation. There were only showers, lukewarm water flowing from overhead pipes, and bars of rough soap distributed by a woman in a white coat. Real soap, not the synthetic substitute they'd been rationed in Germany during the war's final years, but actual soap that produced foam. Annaliese stood under the water and washed months of accumulated filth from her skin. The water was tepid, barely warm, but it felt like mercy. She washed her hair, working her fingers through the matted tangles, feeling the weight of dirt dissolve. Around her, other women were crying. Some were silent. Some stood motionless, overwhelmed by the simple act of being clean. When they emerged from the showers, they were given clean clothing, not new, but clean. Simple wool dresses and undergarments. The fabric was coarse but dry. Annaliese dressed carefully, her hands trembling. She glimpsed herself in a mirror on the wall and barely recognized the woman reflected back. Her face, now clean, looked younger than she felt. Her hair, still wet, hung in dark blonde strands around her face. She looked human again. She looked like herself. That night in the barracks assigned to the women prisoners, Annaliese lay in a narrow cot with a thin blanket and a straw mattress that smelled of disinfectant. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was dry, and it was hers. The woman in the cot beside her, Keta, whispered in the darkness, "They're being decent now to lower our guard. When the babies come, they'll reveal their true intentions." Annaliese didn't respond. She placed her hand on her belly and felt Johan moving inside her. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know if Ketha was right. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, she felt something that might have been safety. The days in Camp Glenmore fell into a rhythm that was both unfamiliar and strangely stabilizing. Each morning, a horn sounded at 6:30. The women rose, washed at communal basins, and walked to the mess hall for breakfast. And here was where the contradictions truly began to accumulate in Annaliese's mind. Breakfast consisted of oatmeal with a small amount of milk, bread with dripping, and tea. Real tea, not the ersatz mixtures they'd been drinking in Germany. The first morning, Annaliese stared at her bowl as though it might disappear if she looked away. She had not seen this quantity of food on a single plate in years. The oatmeal alone was a luxury that had vanished from German rations by 1943. Milk had been a distant memory, and bread, real bread with actual wheat, was something she'd almost forgotten existed. She ate slowly, savouring each spoonful, half expecting someone to remove the bowl and announce it had all been an error. But no one did. The guards moved past the tables with barely a glance at the prisoners. Some of them were eating their own breakfasts, reading newspapers, conversing quietly. They didn't seem like men who despised their captives. They seemed like men performing a duty, and not a particularly burdensome one. After breakfast, work assignments were distributed. Because of her pregnancy, Annaliese was assigned to the camp sewing room, which was considered light work. She spent her days mending uniforms and linens alongside other women, most of them German, a few Norwegian, one Dutch who rarely spoke. The work was tedious, but not taxing. The room was heated by a coal stove. Annaliese's job was mostly to repair tiers and replace buttons. For this work, she was compensated. The concept was difficult to grasp initially. Compensated with camp tokens, a form of currency usable only in the camp shop, but currency nonetheless. She received 2 shillings per week, which seemed negligible until she discovered what it could purchase. The camp shop was a small wooden structure near the administration building, its shelves stocked with items that seemed to come from an impossible world. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, soap, toothpaste, writing supplies, combs and brushes, small tins of cocoa. The first time Annaliese entered the shop, she stood motionless just inside the entrance, staring at the plenty. A chocolate bar cost 4p. Writing paper was 2p. She could afford these items with the money she earned. She could purchase a chocolate bar and consume it. This simple reality seemed impossible, absurd, obscene. Back home, children were dying of starvation. Here, prisoners could purchase chocolate. She bought 1 bar of Fry's chocolate, holding it carefully, as though it might evaporate. That night, lying in her cot, she unwrapped it slowly and broke off a single piece. The dark sweetness burst on her tongue, almost overpowering after years of deprivation. She closed her eyes and felt tears track down her face. She didn't know if she was weeping because the chocolate tasted wonderful, or because consuming it made her feel ashamed, knowing her family was probably foraging for anything edible in the ruins of Germany. Letters began to arrive, slowly at first, then with increasing regularity. The postal system between occupied Germany and Britain was convoluted and delayed, but it operated. Annaliese received her first letter 6 weeks after arriving at Camp Glenmore. It was from her sister Lotta, and it had been opened and examined by censors before reaching her. But it was still a letter, still a lifeline to home. The letter was short and cautiously phrased, aware it would be read by others. Lotta wrote that she and their mother were living with cousins in a village outside Dresden. They were alive, they were coping, food was desperately scarce. The house they were sheltering in was overcrowded with displaced persons, but they were protected and they were together. She asked about Annaliese, about her health, about when she might return home. She said nothing about Johan, and Annaliese understood what that silence confirmed. Annaliese wrote back, her hands shaking as she formed the words. She told Lotta she was in Scotland, in a camp in the Highlands. She was pregnant. The baby would arrive in March. She was being treated according to protocol, fed sufficiently, given medical attention. She knew how these words would appear. How could she tell her starving family that she was eating oatmeal with milk? How could she explain that the enemy was providing better care than her own government ever had? She wrote carefully, "I am being treated according to international regulations. Do not worry about me. I think of you constantly. I hope this war ends soon and we can be reunited." She didn't mention the chocolate, or the soap, or the heated sewing room. Some truths were too painful to share. As the weeks passed and winter deepened into its harshest cold, Annaliese's belly expanded. By late February, her pregnancy was unmistakable to everyone. She moved with difficulty. Her back ached perpetually. Her feet swelled despite the cold. But she was healthy. The camp physician, a middle-aged man with gentle hands and patient eyes, examined her weekly. He measured her abdomen, listened to the baby's heartbeat through a stethoscope, monitored her blood pressure, and declared everything satisfactory. "You're progressing well," he told her, in his measured English. "The baby sounds robust. You should deliver without significant complications." And then one afternoon, in mid-February, he said something that transformed everything. "When the baby is born," he said, "you'll remain in the hospital for observation. We have a maternity ward. You'll stay there with your child." Annaliese stared at him, unable to comprehend what he'd just said. "Stay with my child?" she managed to say. "Yes, mothers and infants remain together. It's standard protocol. You'll be able to nurse and care for your baby." That night, Annaliese lay awake long after lights out. Stay with her baby. Care for her child. The propaganda had prepared her for separation, for infants removed from their mother's arms, for babies disappeared into British homes. No one had prepared her for this, for protocol, for procedures, for the mechanical functioning of a system that treated even enemy children as belonging with their mothers. By early March, Annaliese had been in the camp for 6 weeks. The routine had become predictable, almost comforting in its consistency. Wake at 6:30, breakfast at 7, work from 8 to noon, lunch at 12:30, rest until 2, work from 2 to 5, dinner at 6, free time until lights out at 10. It was a structure that provided order to days that might otherwise have dissolved into anxiety. But structure couldn't eliminate the contradictions that accumulated in Annaliese's consciousness, like stones constructing a wall between her past and her present. She was a prisoner, but she was fed more adequately than she'd been fed in the last 4 years of freedom in Germany. She was an enemy, but she was receiving medical care that many German civilians couldn't obtain. She was captive, but she was compensated for her work and could purchase small comforts with her earnings. The other women experienced it too. Conversations in the barracks at night often revolved around these contradictions, attempting to understand them, attempting to reconcile what they'd been taught with what they were living. "It's the Geneva Convention," said a woman named Inga, who had worked in administration. "They must treat us humanely." "It's international law." "But they could interpret that law minimally," Keta argued. "They could provide bare subsistence and call it humane. Instead, they're providing oatmeal and chocolate. Why?" "Because they can afford to," another woman said with bitterness. "Look at this nation. They weren't devastated. Their infrastructure remains intact. They have abundance, and they're demonstrating that abundance to us. It's psychological warfare, disguised as kindness." Annaliese listened to these discussions, but seldom participated. She was too consumed by her own transformation, both physical and mental. Physically, her body was changing in ways that transcended the pregnancy. Her face had filled out. Her hair, which had been brittle and lifeless from malnutrition, was growing strong and glossy again. Her skin, which had been pallid and dry, had regained some vitality. She was gaining weight, not solely from the baby, but from having adequate nutrition for the first time in years. She caught reflections of herself in windows, and sometimes failed to recognize the woman reflected back. This wasn't the emaciated, desperate creature who had crossed the North Sea. This was someone healthier, someone who looked like she might actually endure. But the psychological transformation was more disturbing. Every kindness, every gesture of basic human decency from the British eroded the foundation of everything she'd been taught. The British were supposed to be cruel imperialists who valued conquest over compassion. The British were supposed to be morally bankrupt aristocrats presiding over a decaying empire. The British were supposed to be the enemy. Instead, the British were men who notified medical staff about pregnant prisoners. The British were women who ensured you received vitamin supplements. The British were physicians who treated you with the same attention they'd give one of their own. The British were guards who sometimes shared their tea with prisoners, who attempted small talk in broken German, who seemed more exhausted than hostile. One afternoon in the sewing room, Annaliese was mending a torn shirt when she overheard two British guards conversing outside the window. They didn't realise anyone was listening, or perhaps they didn't mind. "My sister just delivered," one of them said. "A girl, 7 pounds, 2 ounces. "Congratulations to her," the other replied. "That German woman, the one in the sewing room, she's due any day now, isn't she?" "Yes, soon, I think. Medical officer says she's healthy." Strange thing, bringing a child into the world in a prison camp. Strange thing, being pregnant and imprisoned in a foreign land. Can't fathom what that must be like. There was a pause, and then the first guard spoke again. "War's a terrible business. Nobody truly wins. Everyone loses something precious." Annaliese sat completely still, her hands frozen on the fabric she'd been repairing. These men weren't discussing her with disdain or hostility. They were discussing her with something that resembled compassion, like she was a person in an impossible situation rather than an enemy deserving of suffering. The realization was almost unbearable. Early March brought the first indications that the baby would arrive soon. Annaliese felt altered, different. The baby had descended lower in her pelvis, making breathing easier but movement more difficult. The camp physician examined her more frequently now, every other day instead of weekly. He was preparing for the delivery, ensuring everything was ready, ensuring Annaliese understood what to expect. "When your labour begins," he explained in his careful English, "you'll inform the barrack supervisor. They'll arrange transport to the hospital ward. It's in the main medical building, about 5 minutes from your barracks. You'll deliver there under full medical supervision. After the birth, provided everything proceeds normally, you'll remain in the hospital for approximately 1 week before returning to the camp with your baby." Annaliese nodded, absorbing each detail, but one question consumed her. The question she'd been too terrified to voice until now. She forced herself to speak. "The baby," she said slowly, selecting her words with extreme care. "After it is born, will I be permitted to keep him?" The physician looked at her, and something changed in his expression. Comprehension, perhaps, or maybe sorrow that she would even need to ask such a question. "Of course," he said with certainty. "Of course you'll keep your baby. He's your child. No one is going to remove him from you." "But I am a prisoner. I am German. I worked for the occupation forces." "And your baby is an innocent infant who bears no responsibility for any of that," the physician replied. "Listen to me, Mrs. Weber. Your child will be born here. You'll care for him. The hospital has a maternity section where mothers and infants stay together. You'll have what you need. Do you understand?" Annaliese's throat constricted. She couldn't speak. She could only nod. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she didn't attempt to wipe them away. The physician offered her a handkerchief and waited patiently while she regained her composure. That night, Annaliese wrote another letter to her sister. She told Lotta about the conversation with the physician. She told her about the maternity ward, about being permitted to keep the baby, about the arrangements being made. She wrote, "I cannot articulate what I am experiencing. The enemy treats me with more humanity than I ever anticipated. I was prepared to fight them to protect my child. Instead, they are helping me prepare for his arrival. What kind of enemy does this? What kind of world am I bringing him into? The letter was careful, phrased in ways that wouldn't alarm the censors, but would communicate to Lotta the confusion and guilt Annaliese felt. How could she reconcile the kindness she was receiving with the suffering she knew her family was enduring? How could she appreciate chocolate and heated rooms when her mother was living in an overcrowded house with inadequate food and no warmth for the Scottish winter? Keta had an explanation. Of course, Keta always had an explanation. She confronted Annaliese one evening after dinner, her expression severe. "Don't let them deceive you," she hissed. "This kindness is calculated. They want us to feel indebted, so we'll comply. They want us to forget what they did to our nation. They want us to become passive and grateful." Annaliese looked at her steadily. "And what did our nation do?" she asked quietly. "What did the Reich do for us? They sent our husbands to die in Russia. They bombed British cities and invited retaliation on our own. They promised us triumph and delivered devastation. So tell me, Keta, which is worse? The enemy who feeds us, or the government that starved us while claiming to defend us?" Keta's face flushed crimson. For a moment, Annaliese thought she might be struck. Instead, Keta turned and walked away, her posture rigid with fury. Annaliese didn't care. She had articulated a truth that had been forming inside her for weeks. The British weren't perfect. They had their own cruelties, their own crimes, but they had demonstrated more fundamental human decency in 6 weeks than her own government had demonstrated in 6 years of war. That night, alone in the darkness, with Johan moving inside her, Annaliese made a resolution. When her son was born, she would tell him the truth. Not the propaganda of the Reich, not the counter-propaganda of the Allies, but the complicated, messy truth about kindness and cruelty, about enemies and humanity, about a world where a German prisoner could be treated with dignity by British hands, and both realities could signify something profound about the possibility of compassion, even in the depths of conflict. The contractions began at 4 o'clock in the morning on March the 7th, 1945. Annaliese woke with a sharp intake of breath, her hands instinctively moving to her belly as pain radiated through her abdomen. For a moment, she remained motionless, waiting to determine if it would recur. It did. 3 minutes later, another contraction, more intense than the first. She moved slowly to the barracks door. The night supervisor, an older woman whose name she'd never learned, looked up from her book as Annaliese approached. "Baby," Annaliese managed to say, gesturing at her belly. "Baby coming." The supervisor's eyes widened. She immediately reached for the telephone on the wall. Within 10 minutes, 2 orderlies arrived with a wheelchair, blankets wrapped around Annaliese against the night cold. They wheeled her through the dark compound toward the medical building, and with each movement, another contraction gripped Annaliese's body. The hospital was a converted barracks with bright electric lights illuminating every window despite the early hour. Annaliese was wheeled through corridors that smelled of carbolic and starch, into a room with a hospital bed and medical equipment she didn't recognize. A physician arrived within minutes. Still buttoning his white coat, his hair disheveled from sleep, but his hands were confident and his voice reassuring. "Let's assess your progress, Mrs. Weber," he said. The labour continued for 16 hours. 16 hours of pain that arrived in waves, building and receding, intensifying until Annaliese thought she might fragment. But the medical staff never abandoned her. A nurse held her hand and cooled her forehead with damp cloths. The physician monitored her regularly, checking her progress, offering words of encouragement. A midwife brought water, which Annaliese drank gratefully between contractions. At 8:20 in the evening, with darkness complete outside the windows and exhaustion consuming every part of her being, Annaliese gave one final push and felt her son enter the world. The cry came instantly, strong and furious. the sound of healthy lungs protesting the shock of existence. Annaliese collapsed against the pillows, depleted beyond description, and heard the physician's voice. "Congratulations, Mrs. Weber. You have a healthy baby boy." They cleaned the baby quickly, but then stopped. The nurse holding him looked at Annaliese, then at the physician. Annaliese's heart stopped. This was it. This was when they would take him. This was when all the kindness would be revealed as deception. But the nurse didn't leave. She approached the bed slowly, the baby wrapped in a white blanket. And then she did something Annaliese never expected. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She didn't hand the baby to Annaliese immediately. Instead, she held him carefully, looked down at his small face, and smiled. "He's beautiful," the nurse said softly. And then, still holding him, she turned to Annaliese. "Would you like to hold your son?" Annaliese couldn't speak. She could only nod. The nurse gently placed the baby in Annaliese's arms. He was tiny, wrinkled, his face still red from the effort of birth, his eyes tightly closed. But he was perfect. He was alive. He was here, and he was hers. Annaliese held her son and wept, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire frame. The nurse remained beside her, one hand resting gently on Annaliese's shoulder. "It's all right," the nurse murmured. "You did magnificently. He's healthy and strong." "Johan," Annaliese whispered, looking down at her son. "Your name is Johan." For 3 days, Annaliese remained in the hospital. She was given a small private room with a bed for herself and a cradle for Johan. Nurses visited regularly to check on them both, to teach Annaliese how to nurse, how to change nappies, how to care for this tiny life that depended entirely on her. The food was excellent. Better than the camp food even, soup and bread and tinned meat that was nourishing and warm. But something had changed. Annaliese couldn't name it at first. It was in the way the nurses moved around her. Not with pity exactly. Not with sympathy. With something else. Recognition, perhaps. As though seeing a German prisoner had been replaced by seeing a mother. On the 3rd day, the nurse who had first held Johan came to check on them. Her name was Mary, Annaliese had learned. She was perhaps 40, with kind eyes and capable hands. She sat in the chair beside Annaliese's bed and watched as Johan nursed. "You're doing well," Mary said. "He's gaining weight properly. You're both healthy." "Thank you," Annaliese said quietly. Then, gathering her courage, she asked the question that had been consuming her. "Why did you hold him first, before giving him to me?" Mary looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something that would stay with Annaliese forever. "Because you were terrified," Mary said simply. "You thought we were going to take him. I could see it in your eyes. So I held him first to show you that I could hold him, and then give him back. That we weren't going to steal him. That he was always yours." Annaliese's throat closed. Tears spilled down her face. Mary reached out and took her hand. "I'm a mother too," Mary said. "I have 2 sons. If I were in your position, if I were a prisoner in a foreign land, I would be just as frightened. The war has made us enemies. But motherhood is something else, something that exists beyond the war." Annaliese couldn't speak. She could only hold Mary's hand and weep. That night, alone in her hospital room, with Johan sleeping in his cradle beside her bed, Annaliese took out a piece of paper and began to write. Not to her sister this time, to her son. A letter he wouldn't read for years, perhaps decades, but a letter that needed to be written. She wrote, "My dear Johan, you were born today in a hospital in Scotland, in a prisoner of war camp, in the middle of a terrible war. I was terrified they would take you from me. The propaganda had told me the British were monsters who stole babies. But when you were born, a nurse named Mary did something I will never forget. She held you first, not to take you away, but to show me you were safe, to show me that even in war, even between enemies, some things remain sacred. Motherhood is one of those things. You are 3 days old, and already you have taught me more about the complexity of the world than I learned in 23 years before you. The enemy treated us with kindness. The government that claimed to protect us led us to ruin. The world is not what I was taught it was. Good and evil are not divided by borders or uniforms. They exist in choices, in moments, in gestures as simple as a nurse sitting beside a frightened mother and holding her baby first, not to claim him, but to prove he was always hers. I don't know what the future holds for us. I don't know when we'll go home or what we'll find when we get there. But I know this. I will tell you the truth, always. Not propaganda from any side, but the truth that people are complicated. That enemies can show mercy, that kindness can come from unexpected places, and that in the darkest moments there are still people who choose to be human. The months that followed Johann's birth were both the most challenging and the most transformative of Annaliese's life. Challenging because she now had an infant who required constant attention, who woke crying at night and needed to be fed and soothed and cared for. Transformative because motherhood in captivity revealed something she hadn't expected: community. The camp administration had kept its commitment. The mothers' section of the barracks was quieter, more private. There were 5 other women with infants or young children, and they supported each other through the exhausting work of caring for babies with limited resources. When one mother needed sleep, another would watch her child. When someone needed extra clothing, they shared. They were prisoners, but they were also mothers, and motherhood created connections that transcended nationality or circumstance. Annaliese was exempted from sewing duties for 10 weeks following the birth. During that period, her only responsibility was to recover and care for Johann. The camp continued to provide supplementary rations, milk, eggs, vegetables. The physician visited weekly to monitor Johann's development. The baby flourished. He gained weight consistently. His eyes, which had been the cloudy blue-grey of all newborns, gradually shifted to clear blue. His hair grew in light blonde and soft. He began to smile, to make sounds, to grasp at objects with uncoordinated hands. Annaliese wrote letters home describing every detail. She knew her mother and sister would hunger for information about this baby, this new member of the family they might not meet for months or even years. She described Johann's features, the way he nursed, the sounds he made, the expressions that crossed his small face. She included a photograph that the camp had permitted to be taken. Johann, at 6 weeks old, wrapped in a blanket, eyes wide and alert. The response arrived 10 weeks later. Lotta's letter was worn, the paper thin and fragile. She wrote, "Mother sobbed when she saw the photograph. She says Johann looks like father did as a baby. She asks when you'll come home. Everyone asks, but we understand if it takes time. We are simply grateful you are both alive and well. That is more than many can claim these days." The question of returning home dominated everything. The war in Europe ended in May, but repatriation was slow and complicated. The British couldn't simply transport all prisoners back to Germany. There were protocols to follow, destinations to confirm, transport to coordinate. Some prisoners would return home within weeks, others might wait 6 months or longer. Annaliese found herself divided. Part of her desperately wanted to see her family, to introduce them to Johann, to be on German soil again. But another part was terrified of the Germany that awaited her. The letters from home described a landscape of devastation. Food was critically scarce, housing was destroyed. Dresden had been incinerated. The cities were rubble. How would she survive there with an infant? How would she feed Johann when she couldn't feed herself? Here in this prison camp in Scotland, Johann was protected, nourished, healthy, thriving. The contradiction was excruciating. Freedom meant returning to starvation. Captivity meant survival. What kind of choice was that? One evening in June, as summer brought extended daylight to the Highlands, Annaliese sat with the other mothers in their section of the barracks. They were sharing a pot of tea that one of the guards had provided, a small comfort that made the evening feel almost normal. The conversation turned to the future, as it frequently did. "I don't know what we're returning to," said a woman named Bridget, who had a 9-month-old daughter. "My husband is dead, my home is destroyed, my family scattered. What am I taking my daughter back to?" "Home," another woman said with conviction. "You're taking her home. That's what matters." "Is it home if nothing remains?" Bridget asked. "Is it home if it's only ruins and grief?" Annaliese spoke quietly. "Home is where your family is. My mother and sister are there. Johann deserves to know them. He deserves to grow up German, not as a prisoner in a foreign land." "But he was born here," Bridget noted. "He's spent his entire life in Scotland. What is he? German by blood, Scottish by birth. A child of two worlds, fully belonging to neither." The words lingered in the air. Annaliese hadn't considered it in those terms. Johann, born in captivity, documented by British authorities. What did that make him? A child shaped by both nations, claimed by neither. "The world will be complicated for our children," Annaliese said finally, "more complicated than it was for us. They'll grow up understanding both sides of this conflict. They'll need to make sense of it in ways we never could." In July, as summer transformed the Highlands into green beauty, Annaliese received notification that her repatriation had been arranged. She would depart in September, part of a group of prisoners being returned to the British zone of occupation in Germany. She would travel from Aberdeen to Hamburg, then make her way by train and whatever transport she could secure to her family's location. The news should have brought pure joy. Instead, she felt a complicated mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief to be going home, to reunite with her family, to end this strange period of captivity. Anxiety about what awaited her, about the uncertainty of existence in defeated Germany, about the challenge of keeping Johann safe and fed in a nation that could scarcely protect its own citizens. She spent the weeks before departure preparing. She saved every token she could from her camp wages. She collected extra clothing for Johann, donated by some of the British nurses who had children and understood infant needs. She wrote a lengthy letter to her sister, explaining when she would arrive and asking if there was room for her and the baby. On her final night in Camp Glenmore, Annaliese sat alone in the mother's section, Johann sleeping peacefully in his cradle beside her cot. She took out the letter she had written to him the night he was born, which she had kept carefully folded in her few possessions. She read it again, remembering that night, remembering Mary holding Johann first. This experience represented something she was still attempting to comprehend. It was evidence that even in war, even between enemies, there could be moments of humanity. It was evidence that systems could choose to honor dignity rather than deny it. It was evidence that her son, born to a German prisoner in a British camp, had been treated as worthy of care, as deserving of protection, as human. She wrote one final letter to her sister that night. It was extensive, pages of careful handwriting attempting to articulate everything she'd experienced, everything she'd learned, everything that had shifted in her understanding of the world. She wrote, "I came here expecting cruelty and encountered human beings. I expected brutality and discovered protocols. I expected them to take my baby, and a nurse held him first to prove he was mine. I cannot explain what this signifies, Lotta. It dismantles everything I thought I knew. The enemy demonstrated more care for my child than our own government ever did. How do I carry that knowledge? How do I return home and witness the devastation and not think about the order here? How do I reconcile these contradictions?" Johann was born in a British prison camp. A British nurse held him before I did, not to claim him, but to show me he was safe. Someday he'll ask me about it, and I will tell him the truth. Not propaganda from any side, but the complicated truth that the world is more complex than we're taught, that enemies can be compassionate, that prisoners can be treated with dignity, that even in the darkness of war, small moments of humanity can still exist. I'm coming home, Lotta, but I'm not the same woman who left. I don't know what I am anymore. German, yes. Mother, certainly. Prisoner, soon to be former. But also someone who has seen beyond the lies and discovered something more unsettling than any propaganda. The truth that people are capable of both immense evil and profound kindness, sometimes within the same system, sometimes from the same people, and we must live with all of it. Annaliese Weber boarded the ship to Hamburg in September 1945, carrying her 6-month-old son. Carefully protected in her belongings was the letter she had written to Johann the night he was born. The journey back across the North Sea was more difficult than the journey over. The seas were turbulent, the ship overcrowded with prisoners desperate to return home. But Annaliese kept Johann close, kept him warm and fed, and kept that letter safe. She arrived in Germany to find precisely what the correspondence had described: devastation, starvation, disorder, but also family. Her mother wept when she saw Johann. Her sister couldn't stop cradling the baby, as though needing to verify he was real. They lived in a single room in a damaged house, sleeping on pallets on the floor, subsisting on whatever they could scavenge or barter for. It was immeasurably harder than the camp had been, but it was home, and gradually, agonizingly, Germany began to rebuild. Food became marginally less scarce. The rubble was slowly cleared. New structures rose where old ones had collapsed. Life, impossibly, persisted. Johann grew up hearing two narratives. One was the narrative his German family recounted of war and suffering, of cities annihilated and families destroyed, of a nation that had committed terrible crimes and suffered terrible consequences. The other was the narrative his mother told of a prison camp in Scotland, where the enemy had shown unexpected humanity, where a German prisoner had been treated with respect, where a British nurse had held a newborn baby, first not to steal him, but to prove to a terrified mother that her son was safe. Both narratives were true. Both shaped who Johann became. And when he grew old enough to question, when he asked his mother about his birth, about the camp, about the war, Annaliese told her son what she had learned in that Scottish prison. The world is complicated, Johann. People are complicated. The same nation that bombed our cities also cared for me when I was pregnant with you. The same enemy that defeated us also ensured you were born safely and protected. I cannot tell you that one side was virtuous and the other evil. I can only tell you that even in the worst of times, individual people make choices. Some choose cruelty, some choose kindness, and sometimes kindness emerges from the most unexpected sources. A British nurse held you before I did, not to take you from me, but to show me you were safe, to show me that even in war, some things remain sacred. That moment taught me more about humanity than all the propaganda I'd ever heard. And so that moment became more than a memory. It became a symbol of contradiction, of complexity, of the messy reality that exists beyond propaganda. It reminded them that enemies can demonstrate compassion, that systems can choose humanity, and that even in the darkness of war, there can be moments of unexpected light. Annaliese Weber kept that letter to Johann her entire life. When she died in 2003 at the age of 81, Johann found it among her possessions, still carefully preserved. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but the words remained legible. Written on the night of his birth in a British prison camp by a mother who had expected cruelty and found humanity instead. It was proof of a story that needed to be preserved, not because it erased the horrors of war, but because it complicated them, not because it made anyone a hero or a villain, but because it demonstrated that even in the worst of human conflicts, moments of dignity and humanity could still exist. That is the story of Annaliese Weber and her son, Johann. A story of fear transformed into trust. Of enemies choosing humanity. Of a nurse who held a baby first, not to claim him, but to prove he was safe. Of a moment that meant everything, because it showed that even in the depths of war, some people still chose to recognize the sacred bond between mother and child. If this story moved you, if it made you reconsider the complexities of war and humanity, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories from World War II remind us that history is never as simple as we're taught, and that human decency can survive even in the darkest times.